Hello, hello, hello. This is the Subversive Podcast. I am Alex Kashuta, and today with me is Geoff Shullenberger. He is a senior lecturer at NYU. He is a self-described marginal academic and blogger at Outsider Theory. Welcome, Geoff.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Awesome. So I've been following you on Twitter. I've been reading your blog. I am very, very interested in what you have to say because I feel like our thoughts have had a bit of a convergent evolution in the last, whatever year or so. And we've been interested in some of the same people like Christopher Lasch, Rene Girard, and also in postmodernism, which is, I think, something that's popped up on the scene and you've been involved in critiquing or commenting on recently, especially because of the release of the new, or now it's relatively new book by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, Cynical Theories, in which postmodernism is, to be honest, I haven't read it. I have read many comments on it. I think I understand the premise, and the idea is that postmodernism is a kind of a crucial event that, you know, hit the scene with a group of French people somewhere in the 50s, 60s, and then it seeded the infection of liberalism in the West. And I don't buy that wholesale, and I have a feeling that you don't as well. So if you could tell me a little bit about your thesis and why you don't think that, you know, it was the academic singularity that it's presented to be.
Yeah. So just a bit of background on that book. I had followed those two writers, Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, for, I guess, since they did that Sokal Squared hoax, where they basically got a bunch of fake papers published in sort of humanities and social science, I guess, social theory sort of journals. And some of them were very funny. I mean, it was quite a hilarious send up of the genre. So I found that overall like a pretty salutary kind of hoax. I think it was a good it was a good kind of event to orchestrate. So you know, I was at least, even though I didn't find myself agreeing with their politics or outlook exactly, I at least thought they were providing some salutary sort of commentary at that point. So I was sort of interested in this book, and it's related to things that I write about, which is kind of how, you know, these various sort of theories that are often just called theory or called critical theory kind of have spilled out into the larger culture, right? And that's just something I've been writing about for some years now. So, you know, that's kind of what the book is about, and its, you know, its argument is essentially that this set of theories that are defined by a sort of skepticism about the possibility of, say, objective truth, a belief that all knowledge is a sort of way of asserting some kind of power relation, and, you know, various things like that, which are sort of corrosive to beliefs about, you know, science and the possibility of consensus and things like that. That those things sort of started out with these sort of radical theorists, basically primarily in France in the 60s, and then they gradually kind of disseminated into the American university system and were sort of adapted to some extent to the American context, but basically became all about identity in a way that they weren't previously. And then that from there, they've kind of gone on to spill out into the culture more broadly. So the reason, my critique of the book is that it doesn't really, so I'm interested in that trajectory too, but the book doesn't really account for any causal process by which this set of ideas would come to exert broad influence. It's simply, you know, the reason, this is why I bring up the idea that they use the metaphor of a virus, right? And Lindsay has actually gone into this on his blog as well as in the book. So the problem with the virus metaphor is that it just kind of assumes that there's like an idea, and it's somewhat similar to the kind of Dawkins meme theory, right? Which is that it assumes that, you know, some kind of idea seems to incubate in isolation. It's unclear like where exactly it's supposed to have come from, but then it just kind of spreads exponentially, right? So the problem is there's no explanation in that account of what factors would innate. I mean, even if we're trying to understand a virus, right? Like how did COVID spread? Well, you have certain infrastructural factors, right? Like the fact that there's global air travel and various forms of trade. I mean, in other words, you can't imagine a pandemic like this outside of a sort of globalized structure, right? So, I mean, even if we accept the virus metaphor, there are other things that need to be accounted for to understand how a particular virus would spread.
Exactly. And their premise is that this is,
but I don't think they do.
yeah, that this is kind of an outside infection from, completely outside of liberalism, and it takes hold suddenly.
Right. And so, to put it simply, the argument I make is that if you want to understand how these theories evolve, you have to understand their relationship to the kind of, social, cultural, political context in which they come into being and gradually gain traction in certain contexts. So, I mean, in a sense, I don't think. Part of what I want to do is kind of normalize these sort of outre ideas, because I think in some ways they're not as strange or exotic as people often seem to think. Like they're really just a kind of branch of various bodies of thought that were kind of engaging with the shift to a post-industrial mode of production, or to what's sometimes called, sort of information society or information economy, right? And so what a lot of them really are about, I mean, are explicitly thematizing, as well as kind of emerging out of, is that shift, right?
Yeah.
So
And I
my
think
argument is that you have to see them as symptomatic of that development, and also as, potentially having useful insights for thinking about the significance of that development.
yeah, and I think that was an argument that struck me, because you seem to be someone who's much more, immersed in postmodernism. You've studied it. That a lot of the theories that surround it, like Lyotard, were descriptive rather than prescriptive. They were kind of taking the pulse of a change that was already happening, rather than imposing, a new era and being the theoreticians of this new way of thinking. So they were kind of just describing, a decay that was happening, or a renunciation of meta narrative that was already in progress.
Right. And Lindsay and Pluckrose sort of acknowledge the sort of descriptive character of a lot of that work. But what they don't really address is to what extent I mean, it seems their assumption is that that description is incorrect, right? That it was not an adequate or accurate description of what was going on. But like for example, Lyotard's postmodern condition. I mean, it has a weird sort of publication history. It was actually written as a report for the government of Quebec about, particularly like the ministry that governed like the university system, about, again, within this context of a shift towards a sort of information society, and the various kinds, I mean, particularly the sort of rise of computers, right? Like that was a huge element. That's a huge element of that book. It's written in 1982 or something. No, it's even like early. I think it's like 1979, 1980. That's originally written, right? But it's really about how computers are transforming knowledge, right? So, I think what's kind of interesting is that, the sort of people who want to position themselves as the kind of defenders of classical liberalism or something like that, what they often don't seem to want to acknowledge or understand is the way that the development of science and tech, that they claim to be the ones who are kind of on the side of like progress and the sort of modern sort of project of enlightenment and so on, right? But what they can't really account for is the way that the nature of scientific and technological knowledge has changed, right? In ways that make that sort of classical enlightenment model increasingly untenable and just intuitively implausible to people.
Exactly. And is this your intuition about what the source of our discontent is? That the actual, technological society and the way that's shifted, the tool makes the master and the master informs the tool. Is that you think closer to the truth of what led us to today, and the developments that were codified by postmodernists but not really, prompted by them?
Yeah, ultimately, that's what I'm interested in. I think I mean, from various angles, I've just been thinking about the way that technology has sort of transformed culture and our relationship to knowledge and various other things over the years. And yeah, I think that's sort of the missing piece of a lot of those arguments. That, that and this goes back to, again, what I proposed was like perhaps a better model than a virus could be a sort of autoimmune disorder, right? Where, in a way, the very elements of liberal society that they celebrate, right, are actually creating these sort of feedback loops that undermine the sort of ideological basis that originally relied upon. Right?
I think this is a really good metaphor. I think it's probably much more apt, but I also see why people would be resistant to take it on. I feel like there's this howling void that opens up to people whenever you start criticizing liberalism. It's kind of like saying, "Oh, democracy is flawed." Like, whoa, 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 what are you saying? So it's kind of a scary place. So I think people would rather scapegoat whatever's happening right now onto a cabal of dark suspicious French people, rather than really deal with the fact that this metaphor is apt. The fact that this is skepticism gone off the rails. This is interpretation, deconstruction, the essential quality of the scientific method taken to its logical conclusion, and it's quite terrifying. So I understand the rationale.
And in terms of what you're mentioning there, a weird sort of convergence was that a few years ago, I think, sort of during it, particularly after Trump was elected, there was kind of this weird subgenre of pieces that were kind of claiming that somehow Trump was postmodernism's fault. So, that was, again, it's like liberalism sort of defending itself by identifying a scapegoat. And the interesting thing there was that it's it's often the kind of classical liberal centrist sort of anti-woke whatever types like Lindsay and who are most concerned about postmodernism. But there you have like a lot of kind of liberals in the American sense, right? Sort of standard mainline democratic pundits, kind of dredging up the specter of postmodern theory and somehow claiming that that was what led to Trump being elected, which was kind of a hilarious variation on that whole kind of scapegoating operation to sort of try to, which you've seen a lot of just in the anti-Trump resistance stuff, right? Where Trump is just presented as this totally, this kind of external, monstrous thing that has kind of risen up, and once he's expelled from the body politic, then somehow will supposedly gain some kind of will return to health. It seems to be the kind of guiding metaphor of a lot of these people. So it's kind of the same thing, right? That liberalism in whatever form has to kind of defend itself by identifying some external invader that it needs to expel in order to preserve itself. And that is, of course, what allows people defending it to avoid looking at the ways that it's been a kind of self-undermining project, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's kind of the project for a lot of intellectuals nowadays. And that kind of leads me to my next point. Another writer that you've written extensively about is Lasch, is Christopher Lasch, and he's seen a bit of a resurgence now, partly because he was mentioned on Red Scare, partly because he's as I said, there's a lot of convergent thinking into this direction that's, in a way socially conservative, but also market skeptical, that's not Marxist, that is also not, conservative in the classical sense. It's just looking at the world and, taking on this lens. So yeah, I wanna see your assessment. Why do you think Lasch is trending? What's so great about him?
Yeah, I mean, I think one strain of it is sort of we can thank Red Scare for. I think there's another strain would be sort of people like Patrick Deneen and like Ross Douthat, who are both pretty appreciative of Lasch, and whose books have included some degree of sort of tribute to him as somebody who sort of saw before many people what the trajectory was. But yeah, I think even just thinking about this year, there's sort of an interesting convergence, which is on one hand you have basically people on the left, or who have been historically on the left, and that's kind of me, who for various reasons, but probably the key factor in the U.S. has been the Sanders campaign, failing pretty catastrophically the last time, right? And I wasn't like I think I was more of a strong supporter in the first time around, and was a more skeptical supporter this time. But and I think the way that went down raised a lot of questions for people. And what's interesting about Lasch is that he's somebody who kind of was part of and witnessed the failure of a previous kind of left project, right? Which, or at least certain projects that came out of the New Left in the 60s, right? And then wrote a great deal that was trying to reckon with that in a very systematic and kind of broad way. Without really trying to just find some easy solution, but trying to get to the roots of the problem, right? Of essentially why the left has no real traction in America. So that's and that's kind of one of the things that led him to where he ended up. And then I think a second kind of convergent strain is people who had some appreciation for Trump as somebody who kind of broke the mold of the Republican Party and advocated for various things that and this is like what I understood, partly because of like some of my family background, but things like protectionism, that he essentially ran to the left of much of the field in certain senses, right? In 2016, and that was kind of largely forgotten. But in terms of what he actually did, he did not really fulfill much of his sort of populist promise or any of it. And so I think people who were sympathetic to that say, if you think about a publication like American Affairs, right? People who were sort of part of that milieu or who are interested readers of it, that's the kind of world that I'm thinking about. And I think those people also find a lot of value in Lasch because he wrote a lot about the history of populism in the US and both the ways that it's been able to succeed and the ways that it's failed. And those are, so those are kind of convergent projects that come out of the two sort of failed projects to radically reconsider what the two parties in the US are in the last few years. And then finally, I think he's also of interest to people who are, even more kind of centrist types, but who just have some kind of critique, who share some degree of critique of the kind of hollowness of a kind of neutral liberalism, and have some kind of appreciation of a thinker who's interested in the common good and in some kind of version of communitarianism. So I think those are all like in some ways like the trajectory of the past year politically has been like a sort of perfect storm for like bringing out all the people who would have some degree of sympathy for like Lasch's project.
Yeah,
Or
I
maybe
think
set, you know. But
yeah, there's quite a at least on Twitter as far as I can see, there's quite some interesting intellectual, units forming through, there are a lot of like the people that I follow are some like extremely outspoken Marxists, and I'm personally I'm pretty much a conservative, like a pretty old school conservative, and but we're much more on the same wavelength in this respect, where we kind of understand that Marxism, I wouldn't accept it wholesale, that's for sure. Not necessarily in a prescriptive sense, because, being from Eastern Europe, we've kind of had enough of it. But there is the actual lens of critique, and the actual perspective that Marxism brings is indispensable. I feel like Marx is a bit like Freud. He's just so, immersed in the culture that you can't even feel his presence, but you speak his language. You live his truth, so to say. So it's super indispensable, and I think that's what these guys bring to the conversation. I think Lasch is one of these thinkers that really does bring these two perspectives together. And I've just read his book on narcissism and reread The Revolt of the Elites, and it's literally like listening to someone talk about 2020. It's surprising to me that he doesn't mention Trump at any point, but that's about it, because it's so extremely on point that I always have to check when these books were written, because they're eerie. So yeah, it's quite crazy. So you've been in these internet circles for a while. I'm kind of new on Twitter. I'm still kind of finding my ropes, and there's this whole section of Twitter that is completely composed of anonymous accounts, and on Twitter, and it's quite influential and it's quite powerful. I'm curious what you think the impact of this is, or could be, or what is it? It's quite fascinating that obviously for certain reasons in our culture at the moment, some ideas can only be expressed if you're anonymous, at least partly.
yeah.
And yeah, what do you think the consequence of this would be, or can these accounts be influential?
I mean, I think so. I have a vague idea of writing something about this, but it's kind of interesting in relation to the history of authorship. And if you go back in the history of like print culture, back in I guess sort of 18th century and before, there was a huge amount of anonymous publication, right? That a lot of things were being published under pseudonyms or just without an author attached to them. And it was really only kind of in the 19th century that the standard became to attach an author's name to a work, right? And so I'm kind of interested in this in relation to that similarly what you had at that time was all sorts of risks. That there was this new medium, right, which was basically print, as something that was cheap and easy to circulate, right? And it created both the possibility of communicating new ideas, potentially dangerous or unorthodox ideas, in relation to the church or the monarchy or whatever. And so anonymity was kind of an essential element of that culture, right? And then essentially the shift towards a kind of model of authorship where it was expected that an author would have their name attached to something was kind of on some level clearly had to do with control, right? I mean, it's interesting, right? Because it's sort of ideologically associated with romanticism and the idea that the relationship of the author of the work is essential, and that kind of works are somehow an expression of an individual state of mentality or soul or whatever. But it was also tied to a desire to kind of crack down on the potentially subversive potential of this sort of communication. So yeah, I mean, so I think it is kind of like that, right? You have a new medium, and you have a sort of along with the greater proliferation of possibility, there's on the first level, there's a sort of loss of control, right? Similar to when printing presses became more or less cheap to run, and the sort of marginal cost of those things went down enough that many random people could make use of them. Similarly, like that's kind of where we are now. And so you have these kind of counter effects where on one hand you have that, then on the other hand you have a ratcheting up of the forces of sort of censorship and attempts to kind of compensate for that loss of control on the part of not just the state now, but these kind of private companies that are functioning as sort of deputies of the state, right?
Yeah.
In sort of enforcing some kind of conformity. And so then you have the reemergence of anonymity as a sort of way of being able to work outside of the expectations of whatever the current consensus is, while not while being able to at least try to avoid the potentially harmful consequences of that. So, and I think the fact that these accounts, many of them are popular and influential, in the sense that like you'll see blue check type people with reasonably respectable media jobs like responding to and retweeting and engaging with those accounts, right? So that's one measure of success. The other would just be having a lot of followers. It shows that they're able to, by way of that anonymity, they're able to offer something that genuinely isn't being offered.
Yeah.
Kind of, it's interesting, right? The blue check is very much the sort of, it's related to that kind of way that authorship and like named authorship functions as a way of exerting us. So like, there's a reason why blue checks on the whole tend to be these kind of, just these kind of repeaters of whatever the orthodoxies are, right?
Have you ever considered being anonymous?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's interesting, right? Like, I mean, I have an academic job, I'm sort of vulnerable in that regard. I think, the way I first got into this was, I think part of the problem is because I'm publishing a lot of, essays and stuff with my name on them. It's kind of like the way I first got into using Twitter was just as a way of sharing my work and,
Yeah. Once you're in.
So it didn't really occur to me at the time. Also, when I first joined, I think it took a few years for me to realize the insanity of the kind of crowdsourced thought policing and all that kind of stuff. Like, and that was actually like one of my major discoveries of, sort of let's say, I think I joined in like 2013, 2014. So, the first year or two I was on there, that was like the thing that most interested me, just observing these kinds of insane kind of mob justice actions and sort of witch hunts and so on. And that's kind of why I started writing about Girard in this mode, because it was so obvious that that was the best description and analysis of the what I was observing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's like one lens that, I don't really see spoken about often, but I feel like people are starting to pick up on it. And I feel like, to me at least, it feels like the most damning destruction of the libertarian principle of live and let live that you can have, because no man is an island, no action is done in a vacuum. If I keep giving this example, like if I were to, start online sex work or something today, it would ripple across, my family, my community, the people that I interact with, people who know me either online or offline. It has an effect, and the mimesis is real. So, yeah, that's, to me, you don't really need many more arguments to kind of strike the dagger straight into the heart of libertarianism. But yeah, what was your take on it?
Well, I mean, that's really fascinating, because what I was writing about, let's say 4 years ago, was like my big project was like Peter Thiel's relationship to Rene Girard, right? And that's totally at the core of that relationship, because Thiel is, both a libertarian and a Girardian, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so trying to kind of square that circle is a huge part of what I guess you kind of see him trying to do. I mean, and, but he's also kind of this weird, he's one of the figures in this weird convergence that I got interested in back then. And I've never written about, but I've been curious about, which is the way that somehow you end up with like libertarianism and sort of monarchism and, some form of authoritarianism like converging. And that's basically like Moldbug, right? That's another version of that, right? Although Moldbug is, he's pretty scathing about libertarians, or Yarvin now. And then you have like Hans Hermann Hoppe, who's this kind of odd libertarian monarchist, I guess, sort of political philosopher. So you have this weird convergence of those two things, which seems like it doesn't make sense, but I think it is, at least in Thiel's case, a kind of attempt to square that circle. But yeah, I mean, I would say it's incredibly, Girard is, among other things, an incredibly damning kind of critic of not just libertarianism, but going back to Romanticism, right? It really starts as a critique of the kind of romantic idea of the individual, right? Which is essentially the root of the libertarian kind of vision of individualism, but is also just deeply baked into sort of liberal, mainstream liberalism, right?
Yeah.
So if you assume that we're all basically these kind of, to some extent, we're just vectors of these kind of contagious flows of sort of mimetic influence. There's no, individualism can only be a kind of delusion in that in that model, right? And that's how he frames it in his first book, Deceit, Desire, in the Novel, right? It's essentially a kind of delusion. So, and he links it to like Don Quixote and various of these other kind of, semi-delusional figures in literature, right?
Yeah. Did you find any convincing way that Thiel squares that circle? Because I've read a bit of his writing, but it's never been anything to cover that. He's essentially just he has this whole idea about there not being a coherent vision of the future, nothing being inspiring and things like that. But he doesn't really wear his heart on his sleeve in terms of theory. You just kind of know his influences. Is there any like resource on Thiel that's kind of hidden that people might use to learn more about him? Because he's definitely a very interesting character. He's like the only tech oligarch that's reasonably sane. I don't know.
Yeah, no. So, have you read his essay called "The Straussian Moment"?
I think I have. Yeah, I don't remember the premise though.
2005. But he kind of goes through it's sort of a post 9/11 reflection on, the collapse of the sort of liberal international order, and then he kind of looks at it through various lenses, including Carl Schmitt, Strauss, and Girard. And I think that's a good place to go to kind of get a sense. His political thinking is a bit mysterious, right? He never quite comes out and says, and that's kind of the sense in which he's a Straussian, I think, that he doesn't believe in kind of coming out and saying what you mean exactly. He's kind of more about these kind of oblique, indirect forms of communicating ideas. So, that's, and particularly when they're sort of dangerous or in some way, unacceptable ideas. So, I think you kind of have to read him that way, in that kind of Straussian between the lines way. But the way I see it is, there's sort of a pragmatic, like, version of it, which is that he, a lot of his sort of entrepreneurial work and the way he talks about it is centered around just the basic Girardian point that people are sort of people's behavior is generally determined by these kind of processes of mimetic contagion. And so once you have that insight, it can allow you to kind of be aware of things that as an investor, of like bubbles, and as a sort of somebody running a business, of like who are the people here who actually are capable of thinking independently versus who are the people here who are most likely to just kind of follow the trend.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the way he applies it is actually on that front, right? And so it's a kind of model of leadership and entrepreneurship. In terms of the politics, it was interesting, right, that he lined up behind Trump pretty early, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a version of Girardian politics which is appreciative of a kind of strength of leadership, let's say, which it's debatable whether Trump sort of constitutes that or is more of kind of a parody strongman or something. But that when you have a sort of clearly hierarchical structure, you have and this is where I think, and not that Girard makes this argument, but where you could have a kind of Girardian argument for a kind of relatively authoritarian social structure, which is when you have clear lines of hierarchy, that means that the lines of imitation, or the lines by which kind of mimesis passes, are more stable.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think in some way, my interpretation would be he was kind of attracted to somebody who wasn't, I think on one level he was attracted to the kind of greatness stuff and the sort of, we're going to build, and we're going to make things, in atoms rather than bits in America, right? Which is kind of part of his whole shtick. But there's another way you might think of, like, just his being attracted to somebody who's in a way sort of authoritarian instincts pointed to a sort of return to that more stable kind of structure of authority.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Do you
just
think?
totally hypothetical.
Yeah, to me, if Peter Thiel actually had a sober assessment of the situation early on, and it seems to me that he might have just taken all of this information that he collected about the nature of the world and just transformed it into his own blend of realpolitik, where he's going to use what he knows about the world to get to the levers of power, in a very like Burnham style conquest of the levers of power, and then take the shortest route to the point where he thinks he can influence the most. And I guess he is essentially the back end of many governments in the world at the moment with Palantir, and the way he takes in data and processes it and all of this. So I think in terms of if he believes in something like monarchism, I think maybe his choice was why not be the monarch and be the actual monarch, because if you're now the king of Brunei, it's not the same as being CEO of Palantir. You're
Right.
definitely more of a monarch if you hold the actual levers of power. So maybe that was his assessment, because he's definitely not an idealist, and maybe that was the the shortcut that he wanted to take.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think that's sort of consistent with whatever he shares with Yarvin, right? Whose ideas are pretty similar to that.
Yeah, I think they're also, I don't know if this is all listening to obscure podcasts. I think they work together in some capacity as well. Yeah, is that the case? Yeah, so yeah, it's interesting. Interesting to see all the interesting people, in a cabal somewhere. I'd love to be a fly on the wall, see what they're chatting about. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and this is, I got interested in all this stuff basically in the kind of run up to the last election. Um, Thiel and just all of these kind of, it was immediately clear that there were sort of things going on the right that were somewhat surprising and at least represented a turn away from what the sort of GOP had been for a while. So that's just been something I've been trying to observe since then.
Yeah, you call yourself a man of the left, and do you see people who are a bit more intellectually inclined on the left, venturing and becoming a bit more interested in being theoreticians of phenomena on the right as well? Because
I think so, yeah, and
yeah,
and I mean I'm not sure. I'm sort of I've been increasingly. I don't really identify with the left very much. I think I've been, there have been certain areas of it that I've identified with, but I think what exists today, I have little to nothing in common with. Um, yeah, I think there is sort of a certain convergence and just of people who as I mentioned before, have things to say to each other, right? Um, and I think that, American Affairs is like another good example of this, right? Just like where they strike me as just a good illustration of like where the real vitality is in terms of intellectual life. Because if you look at left-wing publications, some of which I've written for, they're incredible. It's an incredible contrast, right? That they never publish people who are not ideologically pretty much in lockstep with whatever the sort of party lines are. And not only that, when you have left-wing people who publish in a place like American Affairs, which does publish a really wide array of thinkers, right, who are just offering different ways of grappling with um, the things that the current sort of mainstream consensus doesn't allow us to think about, right? And they seem to be willing to publish anybody who's offering a perspective on that, regardless of what their ideological affiliation is. On the left, what you see is really the opposite, right? That people who in some way are willing to talk to them or publish in a place like American Affairs get totally savaged, right? And attacked. And it's that's one of the things that's most made me feel like I don't identify with any of that. I think my my politics is sort of informed more by like, on one hand by reading a good amount of Marx and Marxism and that being pretty influential in my life, but on the other hand from like part of my family being kind of old, like kind of union Democrats, but of this kind of old, somewhat populist, relatively kind of socially conservative, but very kind of union based kind of politics, right? Which didn't really have anything to do with leftism, even, right? It was an incredibly strong part of American politics at one point, and it really doesn't exist anymore, right? Partly because unions have been so thoroughly gutted. So that was kind of my, like my grandparents were of that background, and that's just like where a lot of my political influence came from. And I don't, I don't and haven't for a long time seen anything that represents that in mainstream politics or on the left. I even find I've been involved in like union organizing efforts myself, but even a lot of the unionism is very very weak, and it too often ends up just becoming a repository for whatever the kind of current ideological crazes are, rather than about building a kind of broad-based sense of of solidarity and community, which I think is what it was at its strongest moment.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
know. This is just kind of what I've been, So I was sympathetic to Bernie Sanders in 20. I mean, I was aware of him for a long time before that, but I felt like he, to me, represented a kind of resurgence of like my grandparents' politics.
yeah.
Um,
But do you think your grandparents' politics are in any way possible in a world that doesn't look at all like your grandparents? Yeah, without.
I mean, increasingly, no. I just feel like um, it is a totally different universe, and I don't know what. I mean, I think there are certain value, and this is kind of a Laschian point, right? That there are certain kind of values that I think you can hold as still, remaining valid and important today, while recognizing that the particular parameters of that model of politics don't have much currency or potential.
Yeah, I think that's kind of
Um,
what's coming out of, kind of the echo chamber that we're in, or whatever you want to call it, is just trying to diagnose and see what's actually possible, which of these semi-utopian ideologies are actually represent something materially real in the conditions that we have, by bringing together, looking at large scale complexity theory, game theory, what you need a form of realpolitik now, because you can bring in whatever utopian ideology you want, but they're either proven to not work, or they're probably not gonna, just
yeah,
because it's the nature of how things are set up.
great. Have you read much Peter Churchin?
I've read kind of summaries of his elite overproduction theory. I haven't really read the source material, but yeah, what's
Yeah, I'm sort of. I mean, I'm writing something about him now, and it's. I mean, it's quite a black pill in a sense.
oh.
In terms of what I was just thinking about, or what I was just talking about, right? Because I mean, if his Ages of Discord is kind of an attempt to plot, the sort of periods of stability and instability in American politics. Um, and so sort of the second, what he defines as kind of the second major period of the first major period of stability and kind of consensus is in the early 19th century, and kind of collapses around the middle of the 19th century. The second one is like in the mid 20th century. And so that's basically my, kind of halcyon days of like my grandparents' time, right? When there was this kind of, basically there was an ability to be like them, people who didn't have a particularly, who like didn't finish high school, but you could still like live a decent life and, have material comfort and some sense of community and, uh, some sense of political, your politics being represented kind of through these mediating institutions like the, local union hall and things like that. So anyway, the point is like, it's really, it's this very kind of systemic account to just look at that from a sort of bird's eye view and just think about, what are the kind of ecological factors that you can observe that seem to create the possibility of stability and then kind of undermine it, right? And this kind of goes back to the whole point about liberalism at the beginning, right? That part of what he shows is that, or what he argues, I think some people have objections to his analysis, but it's essentially that when you have these periods, what you essentially have is a relative. You have a relative low supply of labor, right? And so that allows essentially the working class to command relatively high wages. And it weakens the power of the elite, which functions as sort of consumers of labor, right? Because they have to pay a relatively high price for it. And so that's kind of when you get this relative equilibrium. But it's a sort of self-undermining process in a sense, because it creates the incentive for elites to try to find ways to push back against the power of labor. And so, because they're better positioned, they will find a way of doing that.
Yeah, and they have.
It's a kind of self-undermining situation, right? It's a necessarily temporary equilibrium, right? And so, and he's really thinking about it just in terms of there being these inevitable cycles that you can track, and in some ways it's not a he kind of follows it up by saying, like, well, now that we can recognize this, we can sort of mitigate the worst effects.
Okay, so then the next step in this sounds like civil war.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm sort of I've been a skeptic of the kind of civil war. There's been a lot of, it's interesting. I've seen people on both ends of the spectrum kind of predicting this. I've been a skeptic of it, but I think I've been a skeptic of it in part because, there are a few reasons. One, it just seems like there are various forms that instability can take, right? That are not civil war, that are bad but are not civil war, right? Given that we don't have a particularly youthful population in the U.S., and we don't have a particularly big military, it doesn't seem all that plausible. But so the question for me is, how do you imagine, like, what instability can look like when it isn't that, right?
Yeah. You guys saw it this summer. There's quite a bit of instability, a narco tyranny or whatever you want to call it, kind of sanctioned violence on the one end and simmering, simmering non-violence or, little pockets of violence on the other. How these two will meet up and what the next showdown is going to be, because there will be one. I think that's the question. And, yeah. Will the right-wing militias, stand down, or will they say, no, this time we're in it?
Yeah. And I think, one doesn't want to overemphasize, like, how, that's still a relatively small part of the population that's mobilized in that way. To me, what was most interesting and kind of noteworthy was the way that the media, the thing that I've been, like, bashing my head against the wall against ever since it happened was, like, that they, in this autonomous zone they created in Seattle, they literally, like, within weeks killed, Black teenagers, the like local, self-appointed security. It's incredible the degree to which that story was buried. It's totally unconscionable and shocking. And to me, that was, like, the biggest indication of how, like, the relationship between even if you compare it to something like Occupy in 2011, the current media, kind of broad mainstream media is really, I think, just because of the way that it's understood itself increasingly as the kind of anti-Trump resistance, as sort of coterminous with that. It's really just become an apologist for whatever presents itself as anti-Trump, right, is somehow acceptable and excusable, no matter what it is.
It seems like the Schmittian axiom about the friend-enemy distinction has become very clear in the last 4 or 5 years. It is very clear. The lines have been drawn really clearly, and the media is making this distinction for you every day, and it's telling you who to hate and it's telling you who to like, and it's quite shocking. Like even whatever trickles down through watching local media, even in Romania, like local media is essentially CNN. The friend enemy distinction is very clear. And even here, ask any of my friends, they know that Trump is a fascist, and it's quite shocking to see it.
Yeah, no, it's and I mean, this is like one of my big questions is what, if we do have more of, I mean, I don't have a clear prediction as to whether we're going to have another kind of summer of riots and things like that. It seems possible. On the other hand, I can also imagine it not. I can imagine that sort of subsiding for now. But what's interesting to me is if there are more events of that sort. Once you don't have Trump in the White House, how the media responds to it.
Yeah.
If you continue to have these just really deranged people, like these sort of the kind of people who are running that autonomous zone. I mean, just really deranged and messed up people, like really bad people. Whether you still have a media that's willing to essentially make excuses for them and help them cover up what they're doing.
Yeah. What's your feeling about what the media will do in general now that apparently Trump is going to be out of office? Will there be an interest vacuum? I mean, they haven't been doing anything else but
Right.
pile onto Trump. But what will the New York Times do? Will it finally go out of business, or?
This, yeah, I tweeted something about this not long ago. That like the funny thing about the whole failing New York Times epithet was that it was actually Trump who was helping the New York Times not fail, right?
Exactly.
Because of him
Exactly.
not failing. But yeah, so I think the politics of fear will continue to be a big. I mean, they'll continue to try to exploit it, and that will mainly take the form of kind of continuing to whip up anxiety about the supposed fascist threat and so on. So I'm guessing there will be a lot of that. I'm not sure if it will work as well when you don't have this kind of central node around which it can all revolve.
Yeah.
Um,
My fear
but
is
I'm
that
sure
the
because it's been so lucrative.
yeah, they're gonna try to do more, more local witch hunts just because they need new scapegoats. I mean, they've freaked out a lot about the Proud Boys and just
Yeah,
these weird marginal phenomena of guys wearing matching tops and stuff. It's pretty crazy, and Boogaloo Boys and all sorts of weird 4chan stuff, and that was kind of ridiculous. But now that they're gonna have this little power vacuum, what's gonna happen? I hope it won't lead to crackdowns on people who are at the fringes because I want to interview them. So it's yeah, I don't know. It's kind of a time of instability, and they will do something for sure because they have to make money. And yeah, I don't know. I'm curious where the fire hose of outrage is going to be pointing towards next.
I mean, I'm very worried about and this is another thing I've written about some recently, and we'll continue to write about. But I'm pretty worried about the kind of ratcheting up of censorship even beyond where it is now, and I think that I could imagine with Biden in the White House, and also like there are a lot of Silicon Valley people who are really closely connected to him and Kamala, and who will have various roles in the administration. So I can just imagine a kind of collaboration between the Democrats and the various big tech companies to essentially create a highly censored and controlled internet that will be maximally profitable to the tech companies. I think that's definitely on the cards, and that's like one of the things I'm most concerned about. I mean, the whole it's been interesting to see this whole convergence on like repealing Section 230, but for opposite reasons. That basically the right wants to repeal it because they want to be able to um or they want to be able to attack the companies for deplatforming them, whereas the left wants to repeal it so that they can basically have leeway to deplatform more people. And
Is
more.
Section 230 the publisher status or yeah?
Yeah, right. So it essentially means that um, the um, the platforms are not classified as publishers and therefore can't be held accountable for what appears on the platforms. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so I don't know what's going to happen with that, and I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but I think it could be kind of ugly.
Yeah, and I think it is a philosophically challenging question.
Mm-hmm.
You can't really have an absolutist view on this because like recently there was this whole Pornhub scandal, and there is definitely a certain amount of responsibility that lies on the platforms. Are they publishers? Are they not? Are they somewhere in between? I think it's a good question, but yeah, it's also you again you can't have a too libertarian stance on these things, or you get into the territory of nightmares.
Right. Yeah, no, it's definitely complicated.
Yeah,
I don't trust any of the people who currently have um, any degree of influence over them to
yeah,
you
that's the
know
thing.
pursue
Yeah.
that in a responsible way.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, now if you're on the right, you kind of have to be very pro free speech, but being a fair, yeah, I'm trying to look at it from a philosophical angle. It's like there has to be a certain limit on free speech, just in the nature of maintaining social order. But at the moment, the right seems to have to put the banner into the free speech absolutism thing. Yeah, because they're just not in power, and it shows. It's yeah, you don't want your enemies to be the censors, or else your ideology is never going to see the light of day, and they're already starting to do that. Obviously, I see people being disappeared from my Twitter every day, and they never come back, or they come back in a different disguise or something. But it's quite disconcerting. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, and again, this is kind of why I have this vague idea of like digging back into the history of like authorship and print culture, just because it's I think it offers a lot of lessons. And I mean, I'm not the first to observe this, but it definitely offers a lot of lessons because that was the context where a lot of the original arguments about free speech were made, right? Like Milton's Areopagitica. It was probably like the first major pro free speech argument, and it comes out of that time.
Yeah.
We had just all these pamphlets and things like that circulating, and again, that was a period when a lot of it was anonymous. And so, we've sort of been here before in terms of all these sorts of issues.
Yeah, what do you see the next, 10, 15 years looking like? Will there be more Bronze Age pervert, delicious tacos style books by anonymous authors that gain cult traction, or will the trend change to more, I don't give a fuck type writers who try to exit from, your mainstream culture and become kind of like indie academics and try to diversify their platforms and, stay relevant and still make money, but under their real name?
Mhm. I think I would guess probably a bit of both, because I think in some ways those two sort of ecosystems like feed off of each other. Um, but I do think in terms of just overall, I think the traditional publishing industry will continue to kind of lose ground, and you'll have more kind of self-published works gaining cult status, often under pseudonyms. And I think that's going to accelerate in part because I think the market for that is still like immensely underserved. Like you mentioned a few big names. I feel like there's a lot of room for growth in terms of, just sort of like weird and edgy kind of stuff. And it's incredible, how limited we are in terms of like what, New York publishers are going to be willing to publish. And that's going to get worse, right? Because if you look at what came out of this year, I think a lot of them are just basically saying they're only going to publish things that have a sort of social justice orientation of some sort. And at the same time, that you see the same pressures in academia, right? And so just honestly, like even just mild forms of dissent from that, which I'd say is like kind of what I'm doing. I'm not even a sort of hardcore opponent of all that stuff. I'm just like a relatively mild-mannered critic of some of it. But, even for that, it's like you really have to go outside in order to be able to put your ideas out there and get them heard. So yeah. So I think that those pressures are going to accelerate towards kind of greater ideological conformity within the sort of sanctioned official spaces. Yeah. And that should create room for growth in both of those areas that you mentioned.
I think there's, like you said, kind of these two systems feed off each other because there's some form of kind of accelerating mediocrity or kind of like the bottomization of the mainstream that if you just construct this, drum circle where everyone's just telling each other more refined forms of the same idea again and again and again, they even develop their own language. It's like, whenever you talk to, a normie about, normie stuff, I can feel their IQ drop by 50 points because they have not thought about this stuff. They're regurgitating, as we speak, talking points from places, completely unprocessed. And I feel that makes this whole mind space completely vulnerable to outside infection where the actual thought is happening, because someone who's just been marinating in this boilerplate for years gets a whiff of the beauteous nature of whatever's happening outside. It's going to be much more interesting than if the mainstream would have incorporated some of these ideas, because the tighter the grip gets on what's ideologically, what conforms to what they want, the more interesting the outside will be. And I feel like that's going to be an accelerant in the collapse of the mainstream.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was quite interesting to have these conversations. Like it's kind of like the water cooler conversation. I feel like all of those conversations are something that you need to listen to carefully, and that's kind of where you should start, creating dissenting literature. Because anything that the mainstream doesn't think about at all, there's just room to to philosophize about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah, no, and I mean that's, I guess the good news is there are these kind of new spaces opening up. I think the tricky part will be if the kind of platforms that we use become more censorious, as I think they will. And also as so one practical problem will just be where these conversations take place. I mean, it's interesting, like there was an article a couple of weeks ago that was like, podcasts are like the new frontier of disinformation or whatever. So you can see, that's an example of how you can imagine where, again, as I said, there's going to be a lot more fear kind of, mobilization of the politics of fear and kind of new frontiers for that. So I can imagine, there being a kind of moral panic around podcasts that, means that they have to be censored or deplatformed and so on. So, it'll create practical problems in terms of how you get your ideas out there.
Yeah. Thanks for the encouragement, Geoff.
But, that's also what, I mean, hey, forbidden stuff is also always going to be alluring and cool.
Yeah, that's my shtick. Yeah.
about like I mean I was like when I was a teenager, kind of in the 90s, like in New York, and I was kind of like seeing the last gasp of like the punk scene as it was ceasing to exist at that time, and there were some like very edgy clubs you could go to, which were like so smoky that you could barely like see your way across the room and stuff. And I mean, it's been interesting just like encountering these fringe areas of online culture and feeling like my relationship to some of this material is like very similar to how I felt as a teenager, but it's kind of cooler because it's actually like better and like higher quality stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. There's always kind of the limit between what is fringe and what is, absolutely unacceptable, and we're gonna kick you off the internet. So I'm happy to be fringe, but yeah, not that happy to be kicked off the internet because at the moment it's quite a consolidated place. These people talk amongst each other. You could be put on a list, and maybe you can have a Parler account, maybe not. Maybe they'll suspend Parler as well. So yeah, there's yeah, you want to be fringe, but not too fringe.
Yeah, totally.
Exactly. And you are a lecturer at NYU, NYU being a kind of a bit of an epicenter of some of these conversations sometimes.
Right.
What's your experience being in the midst of academia, this apparent den of indoctrination and and moral decay?
Well, I'll mention a story that came up recently that's related to that, although not that I'm not personally involved in, at least yet. But I guess my experience has been, I sort of teach in a relatively marginal and kind of low status part of the university, which is that basically I teach undergraduates mostly writing and kind of research skills and things like that. So I don't have a great deal of like academic glory, but it's I think overall the students are mostly fine. Like they're not as sort of, I don't know, not as much of a monoculture as people might imagine.
Hmm.
And they're often like pretty open to discussing things and not having clear, I mean, particularly because I often teach like for, freshmen. So they're just kind of still in formation. So that's pretty interesting. And I mean, I teach a lot of international students. So, I think when you're doing that, you're getting perspectives that are definitely like well outside of the American kind of liberal arts, elite university monoculture. So, I find it's in terms of my classes, it's still possible to have like pretty broad and open-ended conversations. And because I'm not, I don't know, like, again, I'm like pretty low status. I'm not I'm not on the tenure track. I'm not, my research is not part of my like portfolio as an employee. I'm basically evaluated purely on teaching and like service and things like that. So in that sense, like within the university pecking order, I'm like very low, although not the lowest. And as a result of that, like there's less of a spotlight on me. So I don't find it all that, I don't find there are that many pressures on me to conform.
Hmm.
People just don't care about me that much. It's like if you're a higher profile person that you're more likely to get kind of become the center of a
A bigger target, yeah.
so, and this is why I bring this up. Like, so an interesting case that came up at NYU this semester was a very prominent, unlike me, like prominent tenured professor named Mark Crispin Miller, who's a quite well-known figure, media studies scholar, who's sort of been controversial for a while. I mean, he was like he was regarded as like he's been sympathetic to various things that have been thought of as like conspiracy theories over the years, including like 9/11 trutherism and so on. But in any case, but he had tenure, so whatever, he got away with it. But this semester, he in a class on propaganda, he brought up masks and the whole question of like how it came to be that we're all expected to wear masks, and how that discourse sort of pivoted earlier this year, because there were a month or two at least where the messaging was mostly like, don't wear masks, it's not going to help, unless you're actually infected. It'll provide a false sense of safety, but it won't actually do anything, right? And then it kind of pivoted to, you must wear masks. If you don't wear masks, you're killing people, and so on.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know how that was in Romania, but here it was
Same.
pretty dramatic. And so he just said, within the context of propaganda, it would be worth investigating like how that shift came about, and what the relationship of those kind of aggressive messaging campaigns was to the actual science, right? And so a student complained about this on Twitter and said that he was telling the students like not to wear masks and like to violate NYU's because if you're on campus at NYU, of course you have to be masked everywhere right now, right? I've been teaching remotely, so it hasn't affected me, but but in any case, so there's been kind of a controversy between him and his department and the university around on one hand this kind of university mask mandate, right? And then on the other hand, the freedom to have this kind of a discussion in his class, right? So that's very interesting, and the way he's been treated is, to my mind, pretty discouraging as far as NYU valuing academic freedom. But the other thing that interests me about it is the way that I think this COVID stuff, to a degree that people haven't quite grasped yet, is like a new frontier in the kind of pro-censorship arguments. Because previously, over the last few years, the pro-censorship argument has basically been like, these, some of these ideas are dangerous, but then the basis for that has been like these statistically very rare events, basically mass shootings where like some guy who allegedly was radicalized on 4chan or something, or on YouTube, like kills a bunch of people. But, statistically, those are incredibly rare, right, in the scheme of like the entire population. So it's ultimately a pretty weak argument, right? Because you have to claim that like these ideas are dangerous because there are these, mediatically heavily covered, but ultimately small events. But now what you have is, if you can get people to accept the idea that not wearing masks is literally killing people or whatever, or not socially distancing is literally killing people, then all you have to say is, well, these having free reign to express ideas on these platforms is dangerous because it allows people to spread, anti-masking messages that might kill thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, right? So in other words, because this argument is much more, it sounds much more robust, right? Because it claims that, well, if you allow people to make these arguments, then it'll lead directly to people disobeying these measures and thus killing hundreds of thousands of people. So I think that's definitely going to continue to be used more and more as a pro-censorship argument. And what's interesting is the way the rhetoric of like contagion of ideas, which we've kind of come back to a few times in different ways, kind of mirrors the contagion of the virus itself, right? That somehow the argument for censorship in that idea is like joined at the hip with the social distancing measures themselves, right? That you have to restrict exchange of ideas for the same reason that you have to restrict interaction between people, right? Or you have to sort of muzzle people online for the same reason that you have to make people wear masks. So it's interesting how those two things have totally converged. And that's one thing that kind of worries me about how COVID is going to be used to it's going to be used as the basis for other kinds of restrictions, I fear, that will continue to affect us for years to come.
Yeah, absolutely. It's to me, it was, just a dress rehearsal for executive flexing, the fact that it's, 2 weeks to save the NHS. I still remember it, to flatten the curve, to not overwhelm the hospitals. Oh my, how have the times changed? It's been almost a year since, and we've been in successive lockdowns. We've been, just drowning in restrictions for years, and I don't really see this changing now, especially with the new strains. There are new strains with very different specificities, and we don't know anything about. And I have a feeling these new strains will pop up out of everywhere, and will be the basis for a lot of restrictions, conformity, and I think it's also really interesting how the narrative about COVID has mapped onto the political divide so fast, and how it's shifted as well. Because I think the initial people who were kind of sounding the alarm about COVID were people on the right, who were concerned. And, obviously people like Nancy Pelosi told us that it's quite racist to not, go to Chinatown and patronize the restaurants and things like that. And then, a few months later, only a Trump supporter would have anything to say about the mask mandate, which flipped, as you said, a few times. So
Yeah.
now I think there's, the criticism towards this NYU professor, might also have something to do with the utter, gracelessness of being someone who has anything to say about masks, because only a Trump supporter would. So it's,
And it's interesting. When I posted about this, I had a bunch of people kind of basically claiming, oh, well, like the mask thing just changed because like we didn't know at first, and then like the evidence came in, and that's why it changed. It's like totally not true. I
what evidence?
mean, there's I was going to share this earlier this morning, but haven't gotten around to it yet. But there's a meta-analysis from September, called "Effectiveness of Surgical Face Masks in Reducing Acute Respiratory Infections in Non-Healthcare Settings." Right. So the conclusion that you find in the abstract is surgical mask wearing among individuals in non-healthcare settings is not significantly associated with reduction in ARI incidence in this meta review. Okay, so that's
Yeah.
it's a peer-reviewed article from just a few months ago, and it's it totally flies in the face of the
Yeah,
current
but
what we're being told is the scientific consensus,
yeah, Geoff,
and even
if
the,
it
you
if
can
it
find
flies
other.
in the face of anything that is called the scientific consensus, it by definition cannot be part of the scientific consensus. So you can forget about it. This is fringe science that you're citing here.
And it's and you can find other studies that are a bit more bullish on the efficacy of masks, but they're still like really tentative. The language is always like, this suggests that there may be you know um so the disconnect between the kind of public health rhetoric and the whatever studies, like legitimate sort of peer-reviewed evidence-based studies actually exist, is huge right now. And but yet you have people who will tell you you're a conspiracy theorist just for pointing this out. um,
Yeah.
and conspiracy theory is, and this is something, if you listen to going back to Red Scare, if you listen to their episode with Mark Crispin Miller, this NYU professor, he points out that historically conspiracy theory is, you can actually there's a book by this guy named Lance DeHaven Smith, which I read a number of years ago, which kind of goes into this, but conspiracy theory was actually like kind of invented. Speaking in rough terms, it was basically invented by the deep state as a way of like discrediting criticism of the
The deep
CIA.
state is another conspiracy theory, Geoff.
Right, exactly. But it's like you can actually find documentation that's been obtained by FOIA and stuff that like shows they're like, okay, we have to start calling anybody who objects to this stuff conspiracy theorists. Like, or anybody who has like questions about the Kennedy assassination, they're conspiracy theorists. Or with the COINTELPRO stuff in the 60s and 70s, it was like the FBI was like, well, if you claim that your anti-war organization is being bugged, then we've just got to like seed the idea to the media that these people are just conspiracy theorists. So
Yeah.
there's like there's quite a history of that term just being deployed to like police any kind of criticism of the state. And what's interesting is now on Twitter and so on, you see people who just deputize themselves to call people conspiracy theorists.
Yeah, the bunkers.
Yeah, exactly, the debunkers.
Cool, Geoff. Well, there is one more question I want to ask everyone who comes on the show is there any academic or writer or thinker that you can think of that, you know, you would deem subversive and you would like people to know about, that's, you know, not known of either in mainstream or in our more, you know, arcane circles? Is there some idea or thinker that's floating around there that you think might need a bit more exposure, or that people would be, you know, enlightened if they heard about?
So somebody whose newsletter I always recommend, and I don't know how I mean, he's kind of a, you know, he's not like a super well-known person, but I think is like, has something of a cult following, is LM Secassis. And he has a newsletter called The Convivial Society. And, you know, it's roughly about sort of technology and society. Mm-hmm. And I think he's just what he does do is work with thinkers who are a bit, I mean, somebody who was very influential on me as an intellectual was Ivan Illich, who's I think still yet to have his kind of rediscovery in the way that Lasch has had recently, or maybe Girard is having. But I think he's a really, really crucial figure and thinker, and definitely very subversive. So one of the values of Secassis' newsletter is he writes a lot about Illich, and kind of applies his ideas to the present. And the name The Convivial Society comes out of one of the title of one of Illich's books. So I guess I would make a combined recommendation. One is read Ivan Illich, and the other is read LM Secassis' newsletter, a lot of which is dedicated to kind of thinking about Illich's relevance today.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And is there anything else you'd like to chat about that we might not have covered, or anything you'd like to boost?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always trying to boost my blog, Outsider Theory, outsidertheory.com. So check that out if you haven't.
Yeah, I can attest to it's a very good blog, and I recommend it. I just signed up to your newsletter as well today.
Yeah, and I haven't started the newsletter yet. I've been waiting to reach a critical mass of people signing up, but I'm guessing I will start it up actually around the new year. Was my plan, to kind of do a survey of the progress of the blog so far in my first newsletter. And I'm working on a blog post called Theory Cells in Trump World. So,
ooh, sounds good.
And yeah, I don't know. I think that's the main thing I would plug. But it's been really nice talking to you. I mean, I feel like in some ways we've had a certain parallel trajectory this year of kind of leaning into Twitter more. In my case, it was definitely like, because I had an account for some years and was kind of on and off it for a while. But I really leaned into it directly because of the lockdown, and just was suddenly tweeting a lot more and spending a lot more time there. It seems like you did something similar, as my impression.
Yeah. I mean, I got onto, you know, Justin Murphy's indie thinkers community, and I think someone posted like a thread about, you know, Twitter or something. I don't remember exactly. I was like, oh yeah, Twitter. Okay. I have to get on there. I mean, I'm a writer on the internet. I've kind of been avoiding it because I've been on Twitter like maybe, you know, a handful of times, and I was scrolling through and I got really, really angry a few times, and I was like, man, the power of this platform, Jesus, it just, you know, takes me out of it. But then I was like, okay, you know, you want to be a, you know, writer on the internet, you need to be on Twitter. So I did it. And it's been really cool. Yeah. I mean, it's been, you know, it's very addictive. It's crazy addictive, but also very cool.
Yeah. Well, and you've been incredibly illuminating to follow this year. So.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, the same to you. I mean, that's why I wanted to have you on. And, you know, there's, you know, rarely a tweet of yours that I can't, you know, that don't resonate with. It's, yeah.
Yeah, likewise. And And yeah, I mean, I don't know what your experience has been, but I also kind of hated it. What's weird, I was writing about it and studying it, like going back like years, but I kind of hated the toxicity of it. But I feel like there are some simple things you can do that make it a more fun and less kind of like outrage producing experience. Just in terms of curating who you follow really well, using the mute and block buttons.
Yeah.
I think just finding, I mean, to me, it's like partly just been finding people who I can follow, who I can learn a lot from, yourself included. And, that's made it an experience that's like almost too enriching, as you say, which adds to the addictiveness of it, but it also just makes it kind of pleasant and fun rather than like toxic and nasty.
Exactly. So, and I know I've muted my notifications and mentions from people that I don't follow. I think that's been quite revolutionary. I mean, I get fewer notifications, but I'm not like constantly on it looking, oh, and also I don't get weird tags. And, if people attack me in some weird corner of the internet, I just don't hear about it. So I don't propagate it. So I'm like, yeah, whatever. So it's been pretty good. Yeah. Recommend.
You gotta be able to like tie your, it's that sort of Odysseus, like tying himself to the mast to
exactly
siren song of like random people with no followers talking shit about you. You've just got to tune that out.
Exactly. I mean, if someone really big were to come after me, someone would tell me. So that's my bet. But at the moment, it's just been, it's just incels. I'm kidding. No, I love the incels. But yeah, who knows? Just people with profiles that were started today. That's usually who wants to come after me. But yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, thank you so much, Geoff, for coming on to this, fledgling podcast that's going to come out soon.
Best of luck with it. I'm considering doing a podcast myself, so.
Awesome.
I might check in with you about your experience at some point.
Yeah, please do. I mean, it's still very very gonzo, very low production value. Hopefully it's going to change, but I also kind of like the fact that it's a bit, rough around the edges. The podcasts that I like have absolutely no production value, so I think it's
you got that punk subversive feeling that I was talking about then.
Exactly, just live from the bunker. Cool. Well, Geoff, thanks a lot for coming on. And yeah, I shall chat to you on the interwebs.
Sounds good.